Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open-source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And in today's episode, we're going to give a quick summary and reaction to the latest news involving the United States and Iran, and the fact that both sides appear to have at least agreed in principle to the Memorandum of Understanding, also known as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, that extends the current ceasefire between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the broader Middle East, and enables future negotiations and ideally an opportunity to formally end the war and the Iranian nuclear program. Right now, as of this recording, June 15th, the United States, by President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, have at least electronically signed the Memorandum of Understanding, with the Iranians having signed it by the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf. There should be a ceremony, at least in principle, on Friday in Geneva, Switzerland, where both the American delegation, led by currently Vice President J.D. Vance, and the Iranian delegation, led by the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf, will sign it on paper, which will then enable future negotiations. The MOU, we don't have the text released yet. We did get reporting that the United States expects the text of the document to be released between the next 24 to 48 hours. But at least from the U.S. side, broadly speaking, the agreement stipulates that the Straits of Hormuz will reopen toll-free, unimpeded navigation. The U.S. will lift its naval blockade. And this will then enable future negotiations about the Iranian nuclear program. On Iranian state media, they have stipulated on multiple occasions that they expect, as part of the MOU, to receive at least some of the frozen assets and sanction relief to then serve as a goodwill measure for the United States to enter negotiations with Iran. However, U.S. officials flatly deny this, with Vice President J.D. Vance doing the morning rounds in U.S. media, saying that there is no cash immediately available to the Iranians just for sitting down to negotiations, but any sanction relief or asset freezing released to the Iranians are going to be conditions-based and for performance-based, tied to both the Iranians' ability to open the Straits of Hormuz, as well as concrete measures related to the Iranian nuclear program, which will be led into negotiations of about 60 days, which the opportunity extended, much more centered on the technical aspect. Again, Matt, I think right now the problem we're having, and I think this is going to be the center of the conversation in this episode, is much more the contamination of the information space, and how specifically the Iranians, probably much more so than the United States, and it looks like the U.S. is trying to play catch up. But the Iranians have been very successful of leaking, at least from their perspective, this idea of what the MOU stipulates that seems much more favorable for the Iranian position. And one of the interesting aspects that Vice President J.D. Vance said in the morning, pressers, where he was saying to the U.S. media, was that the U.S. is not necessarily surprised by this. And we've seen reporting on this in the past from, anonymous U.S. senior officials saying that they expect the Iranians to leak false information about the MOU because they need to sell it domestically. And it looks like from the U.S. side, there's really not going to be significant pushback, at least in the U.S. domestically, for the President Trump to sign this MOU, right? Maybe Lindsey Graham, maybe some hawkish elements. But broadly speaking, the more hawkish elements are still within the Republican Party, and they're going to coalesce around the president because President Trump has dominant features within the Republican Party. The Democratic Party just wants this war to end. They're going to leverage this for, conducting attacks against President Trump's foreign policy and his ability to be president. But for the most part, they want this MOU signed and moving on. The harder aspect of this, I think, is two sides. It's the Iranians' hardline elements. We've seen significant, inside of Iranian media and information space, significant pushback on this MOU. And I think Ghalibaf and the Iranian Foreign Minister, Araghchi, have to kind of sell this specifically. And then the other one, obviously, is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because one of the key aspects of the Memorandum of Understanding from the Iranian side is that there needs to be a ceasefire on all fronts, to include Lebanon. And Israel has already come out and flatly denied it and said, we do not respond to the Americans. We do not take orders from the Americans. We are going to continue to operate in Lebanon uncontested as we see fit. So, Matt, with that broad overview of everything, what is kind of your immediate reactions to the MOU, and what do you think are the main impediments that we might foresee for the MOU to come into effect that then will enable further negotiations between the United States and Iran?
So, I mean, I think sort of to your point, it's very important to acknowledge that like we only have like the contours of this plan, to indirectly quote Trump. Like we don't know what this is going to look like at the end of the day. So it's going to be very important to watch how those conversations progress. I think what we're going to end up with is something that looks very similar to the JCPOA. There might be some additional language in that, in those negotiations, specifically around like the proxies or ballistic missile capabilities. But it's really unclear like what we're going to see in terms of like what are the limitations on enrichment going to be under the JCPOA, that was strictly limited to 3.6 something percent. Um, they were capped in terms of the uranium stockpile. And we saw a huge reduction in the number of centrifuges, which is on top of the centrifuges that were taken out by Stuxnet. Um, are they going to be able to match that? I somewhat doubt that. Um, and I think in terms of the money, this is using the same mechanism that the Obama administration used. And while that was, something like 50 to $100 billion that was released to them, uh, we've heard conversations of around $300 billion that they're going to gain access to, the Iranians. It's important to keep in mind it's the same mechanism. It is money that uh, isn't coming sort of like directly from the United States or the allies. These are assets that had been frozen or seized. So just there's going to be a lot of conversation around that, I'm sure, in the coming days and months. Then the other thing that I think you pointed out that's important is yes, there's going to be misinformation and framing. Being put out by both countries that is going to try and make the argument as to why it is better for them. And I think what we saw during the negotiations quite often was they would start to approach some sort of deal, and then Donald Trump would put out a statement that, made everything sound very beneficial for the United States. But then when that reached the hardliners back in Iran, um, it would cause a setback where they're like, well, we can't accept this. And the negotiators would have to go back and be like, well, we didn't agree to this, X, Y, and Z, or even if they were agreeing to something, uh, they would then have to sort of like appease those hardliners back in the country. So I think maybe they're getting a little bit better in terms of their messaging to push this forward, because I think everyone involved wants an end to this situation.
So just to expand on, I think there's kind of two components of the sanction relief, and then there's the asset frozen, and then this investment fund, the $300 billion, right? So one aspect of this is obviously the United States kind of stops the secondary sanctions on Iranian oil, basically allows Iran to kind of sell oil again to, let's say, China, et cetera. And so that's one component, right? Still, the secondary sanctions on Iranian oil is still in effect, which has had a significant impact on Iran's ability to sell oil. The irony of the situation is during the war that was kind of lifted. The logic from the U.S. perspective was to enable the oil markets to kind of stabilize. Once the naval blockade came into effect, then that secondary sanction relief was reimposed, and the Iranians' ability to, once the naval blockade was in place and the sanctions were reinstituted, the ability of Iran to make money from oil trade basically plummeted, right? I mean, they made kind of probably a significant amount of profit in April timeframe, and then it just collapsed after once the blockade and those sanctions were reimposed. So that's one aspect. Then there's the frozen assets, which I believe right now they're reporting is around $24 billion. There was reports that the UAE gave $3 billion to Iran as part of this deal, where then Iran would conduct strikes against the UAE. Reportedly, and obviously in May, the Iran conducts strikes against Fujairah and UAE. UAE was a much more active player militarily against Iran than we historically knew during the war. They were basically, for all intents and purposes, one of the main combatants, where they were conducting extensive airstrikes in multiple areas inside of Iran, even in coordinations with the Israelis. That wasn't really publicly known. There was a lot of suspicion and circumstantial evidence of this, but the UAE played a larger role than previously anticipated, much more so than even the Saudis. And the Saudis did conduct strikes against Iran, but the reporting that we're getting is the Saudis kind of let the Iranians know that happened, where the Saudis appear to have been more active, were even conducting strikes against pro-Iranian groups in Iraq, similar to the Kuwaitis as well. But there was reporting that after the Fujairah attack on the 5th of May, that there was a secret agreement between Iran and the UAE, where UAE then the $3 billion of frozen assets were flown over to Iran as part of this deal, where Iran would not conduct strikes against UAE. It's important to note the UAE has flatly denied this. The Ministry of Affairs released a statement flatly denying it. And reporting from the U.S. side, at least, says that so far none of the frozen assets have been released by anybody. Nobody released the frozen assets whatsoever to give to Iran. So that's the $24 billion. What the Iranians were saying is that they would receive about half of it up front, or a percentage of it up front, before the signing of the MOU, and then the remainder of it at the end of the MOU when these technical negotiations were happening. That is what the Iranians were framing, that was agreed upon to kind of undermine America's position. The U.S. has flatly denied it and said that the asset frozens will only be released based on performance and condition based. And then there's this $300 billion investment fund that JD Vance released, said this is going to be broadly speaking, a Gulf investment fund inside of Iran to help them rebuild their country after the war. Iranian estimates of the damage that their economy suffered because of this war and all the sanctions, etc., is anywhere from between $300 billion up to even $1 trillion. They said the idea of this $300 billion investment firm inside of Iran is basically, if there's a nuclear agreement, Iran is reintegrated into the world economy. This is going to be an incentive to kind of reintegrate their economy, reintegrate them into the world economy, into the international community, and this was kind of be, in a way, a reward for Iran to kind of do that. It's interesting to note that the Treasury Department was looking at using some of Iranians' frozen assets as ways to repay for damages that the GCC suffered because of Iranian attacks. We don't really have the details of that currently. I think the $300 billion is more like the end goal. As you said, Matt, there's a broad nuclear agreement, maybe even proxy is kind of the network is addressed, et cetera, and it's kind of an incentive for Iran to kind of follow through. But one of the things that I'm looking into this, again, we go back to the Iranian piece and inside of Iran. Right. The U.S. domestic political environment to sign this MOU and get back into a nuclear agreement, even if we want to call it a JCPOA 2.0, even if politically the Trump administration is going to really heavily deny utilizing that term, there's not going to be that much impediment. Right. The U.S., it's pretty lockstep. And Israel, I think, they're going to do operations against Lebanon. I don't see Israel necessarily for now doing much to undermine an MOU or negotiations and repeating strikes as we saw during the 12-day war last year. I think the main issue is going to be Iran, but I think the question we need to ask ourselves, and we'll only know this, in a couple months or maybe even next year, is do we run into a situation where either Iran is more emboldened regionally, and as the U.S. intel assessment prior to the war indicated, that the IRGC now has a dominant control of the country after the death of Ali Khamenei? Or is there a situation where Iran has kind of seen a shift where before, led by Ali Khamenei, the previous supreme leader, and General Soleimani, right, the previous leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, they really kind of embodied this idea of Iran being a revolutionary, power. This idea of supporting proxy networks, either through Shia militia groups, Hezbollah, the Houthis, or even Sunni groups and the Palestinian groups against Israel, where Iran was this expeditionary, revolutionary country supporting proxy networks around the world? Or could it transition to now a situation where Iran is much more inward looking and much more nationalistic because of this war? And I think that's the fundamental conversation that's going on in Iran. And I think that's the difference where these hardliners are trying to figure, because it's not just one camp. I don't think it's fair to say inside of Iran there is those that want to go back as everything was before the war, supporting Hezbollah, supporting the Houthis, supporting the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq. I think there are camps within the IRGC who wants to continue that, and I think those are the ones that were most loyal to Ali Khamenei, the previous supreme leader, and Julius Soleimani. But I do believe there's going to be elements even within Iran, specifically the IRGC, who are going to be hardliners, but they're going to be much more nationalistic. And I think Ghalibaf, Arachi, and the current Iranian president some of them are much more the reformists who want to reintegrate with the West, reintegrate with the international community. And then there's some of those that are going to be much more nationalistic, cautious with the US, but much more inward looking. And I think that's going to be the conversation about Iran the next couple of months and years is, what does Iran end up being? Back to what it was and an emboldened, or much more inward looking and nationalistic, which might be beneficial to US national security and interests in the Middle East?
And also, what is that friction going to look like? Because we've talked about this before. Like we don't have great insight into even maybe disagreements among the hardliners. And what you're talking about with the IRGC, I think that is going to be one of the key areas to watch. Um, we're going to see some level of restructuring, and I think that's going to give us clues regarding whether or not Tehran is expecting sort of a lasting peace, or if they're looking at another round of confrontation. And so that would be one of the areas that I would pay specific attention to, as well as like the proxy network to build off of one of your other points there. Like, what's the activity by Hezbollah, the militias in Iraq, the Houthis? We've talked about this before as well. Like, um, these organizations are proxies, but they have varying levels of like their own internal motivations, and they could play a spoiler role to some extent if they decide that their goals are not aligned with the changes that are being made in Tehran. And so some of those actions that those groups take could undermine those negotiations. And the last thing that I would point out is this MOU is designed to end the conflict. And as of right now, we do not really have the outline of what any sort of future nuclear deal would look like. And I think that's going to cause some issues with the leadership in Israel. So that would be a third
Yes.
area that I would look at.
I think the Israeli component, I think, is still very interesting. I mean, obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu, I think political survival really is hampered right now. We've seen the Israeli domestic media um, really hound against Benjamin Netanyahu and calling it a strategic failure for Israel. I think Israel's perspective is they wanted regime change, right? I think now you're kind of seeing this messaging from Benjamin Netanyahu, kind of walking back the regime change. Clearly, that was the goal. And they thought that with President Trump, they could achieve that. Which is not the case. And it's interesting, even if you read Israeli media, they're singling out JD Vance specifically because of that, and then to a lesser degree, but similar, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. But I think the Israeli component is, I don't think it's an immediate piece of the MOU for now. It's a risk. I think the Lebanon piece might be an interesting dynamic, because if Hezbollah conducts a strikes against Israel and the Israelis respond with a strike in Beirut, as we saw over the weekend, it did look like Iran was going to significantly retaliate. And it did take President Trump to directly intervene to tell the Iranians, do not do this, because we do know that the Israelis would respond with extensive strikes inside of Iran, as we saw before. And I don't think that would even be beneficial for the Iranians because a lot of the latest rounds of violence that were happening between Israel and Iran and then the United States against Iran. I mean, militarily, Iran was not doing too well. Right? They were not in a good position, really. It was a lot. The Iranians were conducting more symbolic strikes, while the Israelis and the Americans were conducting strikes that did have an impact on the Iranians' military. And the question then become: are you opening up the opportunity to conducting strikes against your energy infrastructures? Right. So I think the Iranians. That was one of the reasons why when President Trump released the Truth Social post blasting Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu saying your strike against Beirut was unnecessary. That is what the Iranians needed, and Ghalibaf specifically, to then tell the IRGC, see, we have the Americans on our side. They're blaming Israel. They're blaming Israel for the strikes and the derailment of the negotiations. Let's not respond because we don't want to feed into that Israel's approach to do this. And I think that's the interesting aspect where President Trump, J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, I think they view Ghalibaf as in a way, not as such a degree, but in a way as their Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. And I think what they're trying to do is empower him specifically. We do know Ghalibaf has always had aspirations to be the next president of Iran. That is not a dispute. We do know Ghalibaf wants to be the next, wants to increase his power in Iran. And I think the United States, in a way, feels comfortable giving that to him, just as they did with Delcy Rodriguez. And I think that's going to be then the question inside of Iran. How does that do? Because again, there are a lot of within Iranian information space and their hardline media and a lot of their state media and their Telegram channels even, there has been very critical statements that we haven't, I think a lot of the people in the West has not been looking into it. But if you know where to look inside of Iranian media and analyze it, there's a clear messaging within Iranian hardline elements that are blasting this agreement and blasting Ghalibaf and Arachi, that are furious with them. And I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is say, we got to undermine those voices. And I think they found it. And it's very interesting, the messaging we're seeing from President Trump and J.D. Vance, which, and even some anonymous union officials, that they feel like they found elements within Iran that they can negotiate with. And I think that goes back to the question, which is, did they, within the strike campaigns that the United States did, we do know that the IRGC has been empowered, has been emboldened during the war. The question now is, though, are they elements? Because Ghalibaf is not a reformist. Let's make this abundantly clear. He is not a reformist, and nobody should think he's a Democrat, Green movement trying to bring liberal democracy in Iran. That is not the conversation. But is it? Did they find that faction, and did they empower that faction within Iran? And said, okay, you're not liberal-minded people, but maybe you're more nationalistic. Maybe you're more inward-looking. And although you're always going to have propaganda-wise antagonism against the United States, are you much more pragmatic in our ability to negotiate with you? No different than Delcy Rodriguez. Because if you look at Delcy Rodriguez, politically and her statements and the propaganda they release, they're anti-American. But de facto, they're doing a lot of the things that we want. And I'm wondering if that's the case, because my biggest concern, I think, right now within Iran, outside of the Israeli component, which is, I think, kind of the immediate risk for the derailment of an MOU. But again, I don't see Israel bombing Iran in the immediate future. I think that would cause a firestorm in Washington, D.C. And even Benjamin Netanyahu realizes he can't sacrifice the American goodwill with him, with however few is remaining specifically within the Trump administration. My concern is inside of Iran is, are there elements within the IRGC said, we're giving in too much, we're giving the Americans too much, and do we see a coup, a power struggle, removal of a lot of these people? One last point I want to say, Matt, before I pass it back to you, when we're talking about the money, right, the frozen assets, the couple $1 billion, the $3 billion, the $10 billion. When the UAE was reportedly gave Iran $3 billion to stop the attacks against them, I think it's important to note that $3 billion for Iran is basically less than a month worth of oil revenue that they were making prior to the war starting, right? I mean, Iran was making more money a month in oil revenue selling it to the international market than the 3 billion that they would give, right? 3 billion, 10 billion, even the 24 billion, if it's completely released from frozen assets to the Iranians, is a drop to solve the astronomically economic calamity and crisis that Iran is currently facing, which last estimates up to 1 million people people lost their job directly, another million indirectly, hundreds of billions worth of damages, manufacturing completely almost to a halt, petrochemical facilities damaged. Like there's a huge problem in the Iranian economy that tens of billions of, $24 billion is not going to fix at all. And I think that's the leverage that the Trump administration is using with Ghalibaf and other elements. And then you see these voices specifically with the president saying, gentlemen, we can be revolutionary, we can be everything you say, but our economy is in a free fall and we're suffering economic collapse. Reality dictates that we enter into negotiations.
And that is what caused the latest round of protests in Iran, and they used a very heavy hand to put those down. Those sentiments didn't disappear, but unfortunately, like I don't see a way forward um, for that movement when the regime is willing to use such a heavy hand.
Or if I
The
may just jump in, Matt, I think
Yeah,
the,
of
the
course.
biggest losers here, to your point exactly, is this idea, which prior to the war and after January, in this regime change conversation, there was this conversation of, oh, we're going to see regime change, and maybe the Arab Spring in a way gets into Iran, and maybe there's going to be a democratic movement, and even you would talk to people within the Shah, and they said, oh, this is our time, this is our moment. I think what this MOU does, Matt, at least for the immediate future, it shuts that down completely. And if there's any democratic change in Iran, it's very hard to see it because, as you said in January, they killed tens of thousands of people to prevent it. And I think that, at least a democratic Iran, for the immediate future, is a long dream that is not, at least immediately in the immediate future.
Yeah, I think with the United States and this moving target of what was trying to be achieved, like I to be honest, I don't think they were successful really on any of those fronts beyond degrading the capabilities of Iran. Now, with this deal, I do think you are going to see a little bit more focus on those proxies and things like missile capabilities, and so that could end up being a positive from this, but um, overall, like from my perspective, that this was avoidable, and I think we're pretty much achieving, hopefully, and we haven't seen it yet, an agreement that is going to fall pretty much in line with the JCPOA. Last thing that I would point out is keep an eye on the discussions in Israel around an election, because I think that is going to have a lot of sway over how Israel reacts to this, because that's coming up right now. It's supposed to be in October, but there have been some conversations about moving that up. And if we know anything about Bibi, it's that he's a survivor, and I think some sort of conflict is very important for his election campaign.
I would say, though, if you're looking at the Israeli domestic media, Bennett and Lapid, who have been blasting, obviously from the opposition perspective, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, are taking a much more hawkish approach, even. Right. And I think one of the fundamental conversations within Israel that I'm a little bit concerned about is just as we're seeing the Europeans make this argument of strategic autonomy, one of the things that we saw very successfully since the first Trump administration, during the Biden administration, even before this war, was this integration of Israel within the American security architecture. And I think Operation Roaring Lion, which is the Israeli operation, and Operation Epic Fury, we saw this integration of U.S. Israeli military and intelligence capabilities, that rivals or even probably surpasses what we had with NATO. And this was obviously led by U.S. CENTCOM, right? Israel, one of the, I think, the fundamental key decisions that was very successful in the first Trump administration was moving Israel from U.S. European Command to U.S. CENTCOM to mirror the Abraham Accords, obviously the Israeli security integration with the UAE and a lot of these Gulf countries. Look, although Saudi Arabia doesn't have official diplomatic relations with Israel, it is not a secret that everybody knows that Saudi Arabia and Israel, from a military and security perspective, regularly talk and coordinate. And I think one of the things that is happening in the region is Israel's security interest and security partnership, ironically, during the Netanyahu administration, was actually increasing, right? I mean, you can make even the argument that in the UAE, there was this idea, well, was it the US and then China was the primary security partners of UAE. clear the U.S. number one, and then maybe China in some ways because of these naval bases considerations. I think the U.S. was very successful in limiting China's expansion, but now it's Israel, and you can even make the argument: well, is Israel a much more important security partner for the UAE than the United States? And to be frank, Matt, I mean that is a very common thing across the Arab world, where a lot of countries rely on Israel's security and intelligence support for a lot of their own regime stability. I mean, a case in point of this is, Black September, the 1970s, where and then when Syria responded and invaded Jordan, Israel threatened that they were going to attack Syria because they did not want Syria to continue their invasion into Jordan. And I think that's just a case of a historical example that has expanded and permeated through the region. My concern now is this aspect that we saw with the President Trump and how he leveraged this and how he kind of sidelined the Israelis. Do we see a movement within Israel that do we get a country? Do we get Israel to then have a conversation of strategic autonomy from the United States, as we're seeing it with Europe? Now, there's some benefit to this in a way, but there are also some drawback, because the argument I would make: China or Russia is not our primary. If we're going to analyze it, if we want to have security partners in the Middle East, and we want the United States to be the primary security partner in the Middle East, it's not Russia or China who can undermine that. It's really Israel in many aspects, right? And then Turkey, depending on which specific countries, right? But we do know that the GCC, they're never going to publicly admit it, right, Matt? I mean, I think that's a key aspect. Nobody's going to admit it, but it's well known that Israel has it. And I think that's my main concern of this from a medium to long term. Do we see a new movement that's kind of gaining steam within Israeli domestic media and politics of strategic autonomy from the United States? Not saying that we're going to break the American-Israeli alliance, but maybe we see a movement where they take away or move away from American weapons and our ability to influence Israel's decision making, because it is very extensive, our ability to influence Israelis' geopolitical and military decisions. Lastly, what I would say is keep an eye on the Israeli-Lebanese negotiations that are going on and being led by the United States in Washington, D.C. I think the reason why President Trump is okay with tying, although they're saying Israel does not need to leave southern Lebanon. The Iranians want, as part of the MOU and as part of the negotiations, they want Israel to leave Lebanon. Obviously, Israel is not going to agree to that. They're not going to extend the ceasefire there. Where I think the reason why President Trump is more than happy in pushing Israel to accept a ceasefire in Lebanon, I think a lot of people are tying it to the Iran decisions. And I don't necessarily think that's true. I think from President Trump's perspective is the United States is leading pretty successful negotiations with the president of Lebanon, President Aoun, and Israel, led at the ambassador level in the United States, the ambassador of Lebanon and the ambassador of Israel and others. And a lot of these, obviously the dream is normalization between Lebanon and Israel. That's the dream goal. And I think that's what President Trump wants. And I think he is concerned that Israel's actions in Lebanon are hampering not only his ability to negotiate, but more importantly, President Aoun's ability to negotiate a normalization with Israel. And it's an insane thing that what we're seeing is since the last 5 years, if not longer, is that the Lebanese government has been much more willing to negotiate with Israel. We saw maritime demarcation negotiations led by the United States that made maritime boundaries between Lebanon and Israel solidified and signed. Obviously, in the Mediterranean, there's a huge, territorial dispute about the gas fields and the natural gas in the Mediterranean. So there was a huge success story years ago between the U.S. and Israel and Lebanon, right? And I think Trump now wants to expand that to this dream goal of normalization between Lebanon and Israel. And in his argument and in his belief, and I think within the Trump administration belief, that's the quickest way to achieve at least disarmament with Hezbollah, or at least push Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon. And then that enables President Aoun domestically, if they're able to have a normalization with Israel and there's a peace treaty signed or a ceasefire, whatever you want to call it, something signed between both countries. Now the Lebanese government can go to Hezbollah and say, why do you still have weapons? We have a peace treaty with Israel. You are no longer leaded. We should have a monopoly of violence. We should be the only armed state. You need to remove your weapons, which would be a deathbed. Probably the one of the final nails of the coffin for Iran's axis of resistance, right? And let's be absolutely real. The axis of resistance since October 7th, 2023, and even after this war, has suffered significant degradation. But I think President Trump is saying for Hezbollah specifically, Israel, you've been bombing them for years. You're never going to achieve this militarily. You're never going to do that. You need to achieve it diplomatically. So I think President Trump is willing to play along with some of the Iranians' framing of the MOU and Israel's and the extension of the ceasefire to Israel Lebanon. But in Trump's mind, he's saying, I'm much more interested in the negotiations I'm leading between the government of Lebanon and the government of Israel to achieve lasting peace there and the official ideally disarmament of Hezbollah, because at least one of the conditions is Hezbollah has to pull out of southern Litani for some of this to go into effect. And I think that's a huge goal that can be achieved diplomatically, not militarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very narrow path. And I think to some extent, the negotiations with Lebanon look more successful than they actually are at this point because Lebanon does not have that monopoly of violence. But to your point, I think there's a play there that could really, like you said, provide that death knell to Hezbollah if they can normalize those relations. But that obviously requires Israel to play along as well. And I think that is like one of the biggest potential areas for a spoiler in the long-term negotiations with Iran. If it can be pulled off, it would be very impressive. And I do see that path that you laid out.
It's kind of like Doctor Strange fighting Thanos, if I may, all these simulations, and there's only one way we can. And I think that's the perfect example. There's this very narrow path to achieve an enormous geopolitical success, right? There's that. And the other aspect last week that I don't think got a lot of attention, at least in the West, was that inside of Iraq, multiple pro Iranian militia groups that were part of the Popular Mobilization Front, which or by its acronym known as the PMF. For those who don't know, the PMF is basically a body within the Iraqi government, which just has all the pro-Iranian Shia militia groups absorbed into it, and it's kind of the PMF is this idea of the Iraqi state legitimizing it. But it's just the ability of these Iranian groups to operate in Iraq and influence it both militarily and even politically, right? Because all these militia groups have their own political parties. The PMF was established during the rise of ISIS in 2014. This was a way to try to absorb these groups and put at least some sort of government nomenclature over it, but they operate as a state within a state, no different than Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? What was very interesting last week is that we saw two groups that were part of the PMF officially declare that not only they're leaving the PMF, but that they're going to give their weapons back to the Iraqi government. Now, again, one, devil's in the details. Two, we'll believe it when we see it. But the fact that they even announced it was a significant achievement in and of itself. It was a significant development in and of itself. And the question is, one of the groups what was much more important was a group called Al-Haq, AAH by its acronym, right? If we're going to look at the Iranian proxies and the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq, that's one of the top ones, the ones that are very connected to Iran, right? Probably the top one would be Kataib Hezbollah, not to be mistaken with the Lebanese Hezbollah. Kataib Hezbollah is the one in Iraq. You have another one called the Badr Organization. AAH is one of the key ones that Iran has. Very active, very pro-Iran, very willing to follow their orders. The fact that they made the announcement and said, hey, we're going to pull out of the PMF and that the Iraqi government should receive our weapons is very, very interesting. And if you look at how the United States is framing the Middle East diplomatically, it was very interesting that President Trump renominated the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barak, as not only the U.S. special envoy for Syria, where he continues that, but they extended that to Iraq as well, right? And I think that's the conversation of the Levant, right? We remember the famous saying from King Abdullah of Jordan said that Iran is building a Shia crescent from Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, right? With all these militia groups, the Shia crescent. And I think what the Trump administration is trying to do diplomatically now is start chipping that away. Militarily, they've been severely weakened. So how can we get it over? The negotiations between Israel and Lebanon within the government for Lebanese Hezbollah. Obviously, the fall of Bashar al-Assad was a deathbed for Iran's axis of resistance. Their presence in Syria is almost non-existent compared to where it was in the past. And now, with Tom Barak leading Iraq and these groups and making these announcements, I think the U.S. is going to continue this diplomatic and political pressure in Iraq to remove the PMF and these pro-Iranian groups inside of Iraq. And it goes then back to within Iran and saying, look at the axis of resistance, look at what Ali Khamenei and General Soleimani brought to you, look at all the protests that happened as a response to it. Because one of the rallying cries of the protests from an economic perspective from the Iranian protesters was, you know, I'm not, not to Gaza, not to Syria, not to Iraq, not to Lebanon, but for Iran, right? We fight and die for Iran, this nationalistic conversation. And Iran is a very nationalistic country, but they even have some of this idea of like this Iranian first mentality. And I think that's what the Trump administration is going to try to do, is to limit the axis of resistance diplomatically, maybe not directly from the Iranians. Maybe it's very hard to get that diplomatically for the Iranians to agree. Maybe there's an opportunity there where Iran make an agreement because it's just fait accompli at some point. Obviously, the ballistic missile program and the drones, there was a military degradation. It's going to take years for the Iranians to rebuild it. I don't think that's going to have really much more conversations outside of that. We've already seen the administration highlight that from a military production capability, and which there's a lot of truth to that. Iran has been significantly degraded in that aspect, and their military suffered enormously. But I think it's now empowering that nationalistic perspective. So keep an eye on Lebanon, keep an eye on these negotiations happening, but keep an eye on Tom Barak, who's now the U.S. Special Envoy, not only for Syria, but for Iraq, and see those questions. The last area then that is open to would then, if this is the ideal scenario and we see the success, then what happens to the Houthis? The Houthis are a key one that is remaining. Obviously, there's negotiations, there's still military aspect. We talked about the Southern Transitional Council failure there and the recognized government, but that would be the wild card, right? But the Houthis, we've talked about this extensively, Matt. They're always that, out of all the proxies that Iran has, they're the more wild card and not so beholden to Iran. So I think that's the area that we're looking for and that we need to keep an eye on. But obviously, we're going to have another episode with this. We're going to bring our regular guest, John Lareer, Defense Bulletin, to talk about this. Obviously, we're going to have to wait in Friday for the signing, these technical negotiations that look like are to be much more centered on the nuclear program. We'll see what actually gets agreed upon. But there's medium to long-term implications that I think we need to look at. And I'm glad that this episode really touched upon that, the hindrance, the opportunities, and we'll see what we go from there.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect area to put a pin on it. I do want to talk at some point a little bit more about, Israel developing a little bit more independence because I think we have started to see that move in the intelligence sector with, development of things like Pegasus. Like they are uh sort of spreading their wings there. And I think a logical next step is the security and military side of that. So that would be a really interesting topic for the future. But with that, this has been the bottom line up front. We will talk to you soon.